Daniel Carter slammed his front door open and froze. 6 strangers were sitting in his living room. Before he could speak, Emily grabbed his hand so tight he felt her fingers trembling, and she smiled at her family like her life depended on it. "Everyone, this is Daniel, my future husband." The room erupted in applause, and Daniel stood there holding a woman's hand, surrounded by people who believed he was engaged to his roommate, a woman he had never once kissed. What happened next over that weekend would unravel 5 years of walls he had built around his heart. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss where this goes. Daniel Carter had a rule about his front door. He always paused before opening it. Just 1 second, sometimes 2. It wasn't superstition. It wasn't habit either, not exactly. It was something he had developed over the past 5 years without ever really naming it, a kind of quiet bracing. A small private ritual that said, whatever is on the other side, you can handle it. He had opened that door to a lot of things. He had opened it to the night his wife told him she was leaving. He had opened it to the sheriff who handed him divorce papers on a Tuesday morning while Lily was at school. He had opened it to empty evenings and quiet weekends, and the particular kind of silence that settles into a house when the person who used to fill it with noise simply stops coming home. He could handle silence. He had learned how. So on that Friday evening in October, when Daniel pulled into his driveway after a 10-hour shift managing inventory at a mid-sized logistics company, when he sat in his truck for an extra moment longer than usual because his back ached and his eyes burned, and all he wanted was a cold glass of water and maybe 30 minutes of baseball on the television before Lily needed her bath. He did what he always did. He paused at the door. He took one breath, and then he opened it. The living room was full of people, not 1 or 2, not neighbors stopping by. Full. 6 adults sat across his sofa, his armchairs, his dining chairs that had been dragged in from the kitchen. The overhead light was on, a light Daniel almost never turned on, because it made the room feel like an interrogation room, and it illuminated 6 unfamiliar faces, all turning toward him at the same exact moment, like sunflowers pivoting toward a window. For 1 terrible second, Daniel thought he had walked into the wrong house. Then he heard her. "Daniel." Emily's voice came from his left, sharp and quiet, at the same time, the way you say someone's name when you are trying to communicate an entire paragraph in a single word. He turned and she was there. Emily Brooks, his roommate, his tenant, the woman who had lived in his spare bedroom for the past 2 years, and she was moving toward him faster than he had ever seen her move, her eyes wide and carrying something he could not immediately identify. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was closer to terror. She reached him before he could speak. She reached out and took his hand, both hands, her fingers wrapping around his knuckles with a grip that was firm and desperate all at once, and she turned to face the room with a smile that was absolutely unmistakably 100% fake. "Everyone," Emily said, her voice landing somewhere between bright and strangled. "This is Daniel." A pause. The kind of pause that has weight to it. "My future husband." The room erupted, not loudly, not the way a crowd erupts at a football game, but in the way that small family gatherings erupt, with warmth and movement and sudden noise. People standing up from their chairs and reaching for each other. A woman near the window, pressing her hand to her chest. A man in a gray sweater nodding slowly with an expression that said, "Finally." And Daniel stood completely still. He did not move. He did not speak. How was in that moment, a man trying to process information that his brain simply refused to accept, the way a computer freezes when asked to run too many programs at once. He was holding Emily's hands. He was being watched by 6 people. One of those people was openly crying. A small woman near the sofa with Emily's cheekbones, and Emily's dark hair streaked silver at the temples, pressing a folded tissue to the corners of her eyes. Future husband. Daniel was somebody's future husband. He had not been informed of this. The next few minutes happened in a kind of controlled blur. People introduced themselves. Emily's parents, Margaret and Robert Brooks, visiting from Phoenix, where they had retired the previous spring. Her Aunt Carol and Uncle Phil from Denver. 2 women who had apparently been Emily's closest friends since high school. Diane and Roxanne, who drove up together from Pueblo specifically for this visit, and who were currently looking at Daniel with the particular intensity of women who had been told the story of a man, and were now running him against whatever image they had built in their heads. Daniel shook hands. He said "nice to meet you" approximately 6 times. He accepted a hug from Margaret Brooks that lasted slightly longer than he expected, the woman squeezing his arm before she pulled back and looked at him with wet eyes and said, "We've heard so much about you." Daniel said, "All good things, I hope," which was the only sentence his brain was capable of producing. Margaret laughed. "Only the best," she said, and then she looked at her daughter with an expression that Daniel could only describe as relief. Bone-deep, years-long relief, the kind that has been waiting a long time to finally land somewhere. He smiled. He kept smiling. He was very good at performing calm. 5 years of solo parenting had given him an advanced degree in it. But the entire time he was watching Emily. And Emily was not looking at him. She was talking to her aunt. She was refilling someone's glass of sweet tea from the pitcher on the coffee table. She was laughing at something Diane said. She was doing everything with the focused energy of a woman who had built a wall between herself and the moment of reckoning, waiting for her on the other side of the evening. She knew it was coming. He knew it was coming. And so the evening continued dinner that Emily had apparently prepared while he was at work, a pot roast with potatoes and green beans that smelled extraordinary, and that Daniel ate while sitting beside his supposed fiancée, managing questions and smiles, and the low hum of a family gathering that he was by all current accounts now a part of. Lily had fallen asleep on the love seat by 7:30, curled under the blanket with the cartoon foxes that she refused to let Emily wash, because she claimed it still smelled like the old stuffed animal it had replaced. Nobody had woken her. Emily had draped an extra throw blanket across her small shoulders without being asked. Daniel watched her do it. He filed that away without knowing why. It was almost 10 o'clock when the guests finally settled, the visiting relatives retreating to the guest room and the pull-out sofa that Emily had clearly prepared in advance, Diane and Roxanne heading to a hotel down the road with promises to return for brunch tomorrow. The house went quiet by degrees, the way houses do. First, the voices, then the footsteps, then the particular absence of sound that follows when people stop moving through a space. Daniel was washing the last of the dinner plates when he heard the kitchen door open behind him. He didn't turn around. "Before you say anything," Emily said. "I'm not saying anything," Daniel said. "You're doing the quiet thing," Emily said. "The quiet thing is worse than yelling." He set the plate on the drying rack. He turned off the faucet. He turned around and looked at her. Emily Brooks was standing in the doorway of his kitchen in an oversized gray cardigan, her dark hair pulled back, her arms crossed over her chest in the particular way she held herself when she was trying to look unbothered and failing completely. She was 30 years old, and she was exhausted, and she was bracing herself in exactly the way he had braced himself at the front door 3 hours ago. And for a moment, he recognized the gesture so completely that it almost stopped him cold. "Okay," Daniel said. "Explain." Emily exhaled. She walked to the kitchen table and pulled out a chair and sat down, and she looked at her own hands for a long moment before she started talking. "They called me this morning," she said. "My mom called me at 7 in the morning to tell me they were driving up. Not asking. Telling. I had 8 hours to, I don't know, to figure out how to exist in the same room as my mother for an entire weekend without the conversation going where it always goes." "Where does it always go?" Emily looked up at him. "You know where it goes, Daniel." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Tell me anyway." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My mother has been asking me about marriage since I was 23 years old. Every holiday, every phone call, every time I see her." She paused. "She doesn't mean it cruelly. I want you to understand that. She genuinely believes that my life isn't complete, I guess, until I find someone. Until someone chooses me." She said those last 3 words in a specific way. Not bitterly, not angrily, just plainly the way you say something that is simply true and has been true for so long that the pain of it has worn smooth. "And the problem," Emily continued, "is that for a long time I believed it too." Daniel was quiet. "When they pulled into the driveway," Emily said, My mom saw your jacket by the door, the one you leave on the hook. And she saw 2 coffee mugs on the counter and Lily's drawings on the refrigerator with my name on one of them." She stopped, swallowed. She assumed. "And she looked happy, Daniel. In a way I don't see very often. And my aunt was already hugging me, and I panicked." "You introduced me as your fiancé," Daniel said. "I know. To 6 people. I know. Including your parents. Daniel. Emily." He leaned forward. "What exactly is the plan here?" She pressed her lips together. "I thought maybe just for the weekend we could pretend. I know how it sounds." "Does it sound insane?" Daniel asked. "Because from where I'm sitting it sounds insane." "It sounds insane," Emily agreed. "Yes." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Daniel said, "What happens Monday when they go home, and your mother starts calling to plan the wedding?" Emily closed her eyes briefly. "I will figure that out on Monday." "Emily, I know, okay, I know." She opened her eyes and looked at him, and there was something raw there, something she hadn't let into the kitchen with her, but that had followed her in anyway. "I'm not asking you to lie for me forever. I'm asking you to give me one weekend where I am not the daughter who couldn't get it together. One weekend where my mother looks at me the way she looked at me tonight, like she's not worried about me for once in her life." Her voice thinned slightly on the last sentence, but she kept it level. Barely. "That's all. One weekend." Daniel looked at her for a long time. He thought about the way Margaret Brooks had hugged him. The relief in her face. He thought about the way Emily had draped that extra blanket over Lily without anyone asking. He thought about 5 years of a house that had slowly, quietly become something different than it was before she moved in. "You owe me," he said finally. Emily blinked. "What?" "You owe me significantly," Daniel said. "I want that on the record." A breath. Something releasing in her shoulders. "Okay. And we need a story." "Right. A real one. Not something we're making up on the fly when your father asks questions." He pulled his hand through his hair. "How did we meet?" We lived together," Emily said. "We know that. They don't know that. When did this become romantic?" Emily thought about it. 6 months ago." "What happened 6 months ago?" "I don't know. You could have asked me to dinner." "Why would I have asked you to dinner 6 months ago, specifically?" "Because..." She stopped. Thought about it. "Because Lily had a really bad week at school. You remember when that girl said something awful about her drawings and she cried for 3 days?" Daniel remembered. He remembered it specifically and precisely, and not pleasantly. "And you made that soup," Emily said. "The tomato one, from scratch. And Lily stopped crying and said it was the best soup she'd ever had. And you looked at me across the kitchen and said, 'You said, how do people do this alone?'" The memory landed in Daniel's chest with unexpected weight. He had said that. He remembered saying it. He hadn't thought about it since. "And I said they don't." Emily was looking at her hands again. "And maybe that's when you in the story, I mean. Maybe that's when things started to shift." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. "That works." Yeah. He stood up and carried his glass to the sink. "Get some sleep, Emily. We've got a full day tomorrow." He was halfway to the doorway when she said, "Daniel." He turned. She was still sitting at the table looking up at him, her arms wrapped around herself. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through him that he didn't examine too closely. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We haven't survived your mother." The thing about lying, Daniel would think later, is that it has a specific temperature. A brand new lie is cold, uncomfortable. You can feel it in your hands in the way your eyes move a half second too fast when someone asks a direct question. You know it isn't real, and your body knows it, and the gap between those two things creates a very specific kind of friction. But a lie built out of true materials, those are different. Those are warm. Saturday morning. Emily's mother made pancakes in Daniel's kitchen, while Robert Brooks sat at the table reading the paper and asking Daniel questions about his work in the careful, methodical way of a man who is not so much making conversation as conducting an interview. The questions were reasonable, respectful even. How long had Daniel been in logistics? Did he find the work satisfying? Or was it the kind of job a man did because it paid well and stability mattered more than passion at a certain point in life? Daniel answered honestly. It was the kind of job he had taken because stability mattered. He had a daughter. Passion was a luxury for people without dependence. Robert Brooks nodded at that, just once. But there was something in the nod. Across the kitchen, Emily was helping her mother flip pancakes and half listening to their conversation, and Daniel could tell she was half listening by the way she went very still at certain moments and then resumed moving. Lily woke up at 8:30 and walked into the kitchen in her pajamas with her hair at a violent angle and looked at the collection of strangers occupying her usual morning space, and said with the bluntness that 7-year-olds specialize in, "Who are all these people?" The room laughed. "These are Emily's family," Daniel said. "Come say hi." Lily studied them for a moment with the unnerving directness that children apply to adults when deciding whether they are trustworthy. Then she walked to Margaret Brooks, who was closest, and said, "Do you know how to braid hair?" Margaret laughed so hard her eyes watered. As a matter of fact, she said, "I do." And just like that, Lily climbed up onto the chair beside her, and the conversation moved on, and Daniel stood in his kitchen watching his daughter get her hair braided by a woman who believed she was going to be her step-grandmother and felt something he couldn't quite name shifting underneath his feet. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't dishonesty exactly. It was something closer to recognition. The stories came naturally. That was the part that unsettled him. When Carol asked how Daniel had proposed a question that arrived without warning during Saturday lunch, delivered with the cheerful energy of a woman who had been dying to ask it since the night before. Daniel looked at Emily across the table, and something passed between them, the rapid, silent negotiation of two people who had been sharing a home long enough to read each other. "It wasn't planned," Daniel said, which was true. Nothing about this was planned. "It was a Sunday morning," he continued. "Early. Emily was making coffee and Lily was still asleep, and it was just quiet. In the good way." He paused. "And I looked at her and I thought this is already what I want, this exact thing. And it didn't seem right to keep pretending it wasn't." The table was silent. Emily was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Carol pressed her hand to her heart. "That is the most honest proposal story I have ever heard," she said. "It's not much of a story," Daniel said. "No," Carol said. "That's why it's honest." Later, when the dishes were being cleared, and Emily passed him in the narrow space between the table and the counter, she leaned slightly toward him and said quietly enough that only he could hear, "You didn't have to make it that good." "I didn't make it up," Daniel said. Emily stopped, looked at him. He picked up the nearest plate and carried it to the kitchen. That evening, while the older relatives watched television and Lily demonstrated her recent mastery of a card game she had invented herself, with rules she changed whenever she was losing, Daniel found himself standing alone on the back porch. The October air was sharp, Colorado cold that came in from the mountains in the evenings, the kind of cold that clarified things. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, and he let himself for the first time all day actually think. He had told a story this afternoon. A story about a Sunday morning coffee quiet certainty. He had told it, and it had landed as true, not because he was a skilled liar, but because it was true. Not in the literal sequence of events, but in something underneath the events. The feeling of it was true. He recognized the Sunday mornings. He recognized the quiet. He recognized the specific comfort of a house where someone else was present, and that presence was not burden, but simply weight. The right kind of weight. Ballast. He had been calling Emily his roommate for 2 years. He had never stopped to ask himself why the word had started to feel insufficient. The back door opened and closed behind him. He didn't turn around, but he heard her footsteps cross the wooden boards and stop beside him close, but not touching. They stood in silence for a moment. "Your dad asked me something interesting," Daniel said. "He asks everyone interesting things," Emily said. "It's his thing. He asked me what I was afraid of. Emily was quiet. I said the obvious things first, Daniel said. Failure, letting Lily down, not being enough. He paused. And then he said, "What are you afraid of that you don't say out loud?" The cold air moved through the yard. "What did you say?" Emily asked. "I said I was afraid of trusting the good things." Daniel turned his head slightly, but didn't quite look at her. "I said that after the divorce I got very good at managing expectations, keeping things at a distance where they couldn't do too much damage. And the problem with that strategy is that the things you're protecting yourself from and the things that might actually be worth the risk start to look identical after a while. You can't tell them apart." Emily said nothing, but she was listening. He could feel her listening beside him in the way you can feel someone paying attention, a particular quality of stillness. "Your father said the men I respect most aren't the ones who avoided pain. They're the ones who decided the people in front of them were worth it anyway." A long pause. "That sounds like him," Emily said finally. "Is he right?" Daniel asked. Another pause. Longer this time. "I think so," Emily said. "I've been trying to live like he's wrong for most of my adult life, and it hasn't worked out that well." Daniel almost smiled at that. They stood on the porch a little longer. The lights from the kitchen fell through the window and across the yard in long yellow rectangles. And somewhere inside, Lily was laughing about something, that particular laugh of hers, high and sudden and completely unguarded. And it carried out through the walls, into the cold air. "She's good in there," Emily said. "She always is when you're around," Daniel said. He felt, rather than saw, Emily turn to look at him. He looked straight ahead at the yard. "I mean that as a fact," he said. I'm not trying to make this more complicated than it already is." "Okay," Emily said. Her voice was very quiet. He stopped, started again. "I have been very careful, Emily, for a very long time, about what I let matter to me, because when things matter, they can be taken." He exhaled. "And somewhere in the last 2 years, without me noticing, or maybe without me admitting, I noticed some things got past my perimeter." The word "some" was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and they both knew it. Emily didn't push. That Daniel would think later was one of the things he had filed away without examining. She had never pushed. In 2 years of shared space and late evenings and conversations over coffee, and 100 small moments that had quietly stacked up into something, she had never once pushed him towards something he wasn't ready for. "We should go back inside," he said. "Yeah," Emily said. Neither of them moved for another minute. Then they went back inside, and Daniel helped Lily with her bath and her bedtime story. The Velveteen Rabbit, her current obsession. A story about becoming real. That Daniel was starting to think was actually about something else entirely. And when he turned off the light and closed Lily's door and stood in the hallway alone, he leaned his back against the wall and stayed there for a long moment in the dark. He was not pretending, he thought. That was the problem. He had agreed to pretend. He had walked into the living room yesterday evening, prepared to perform a relationship, to manage a fiction for a weekend, to be helpful in the way that competent, practical men are helpful when someone they care about needs them. But somewhere between the kitchen table and the back porch and the story about a Sunday morning and coffee and certainty, the performance had slipped. And underneath it was something that had apparently been there for longer than he wanted to admit. He pushed off the wall. He walked to his room. He lay in the dark for a long time with the sound of the house around him, its creaks, its settling, the familiar patterns of a place that had been his responsibility for years, and he thought about how a house becomes a home. Not through the large moments, not through decisions and declarations and formal occasions, but through the accumulation of small ones. Packed lunches, repaired toys, Sunday morning coffee. The particular laugh of a child carried through walls on cold October air. Daniel Carter lay in the dark and understood quietly, and with some alarm, that he was in a great deal of trouble. The good kind. Sunday came the way Sundays do, with the particular softness of mornings when the pressure of the week hasn't yet started to build light coming through windows at the slow amber angle of seasons turning. Lily was awake before anyone else. She padded into the kitchen, poured herself a cup of juice with the focused concentration of a surgeon, and was halfway through it when Margaret Brooks appeared in the doorway. "Good morning," Lily said. "Good morning, sweetheart," Margaret said. "Emily says you live in Arizona," Lily said. "Phoenix," Margaret said. "Is it always hot?" "In the summer it is. Dad says Colorado is cold enough for both of us." Lily considered this. Emily likes the cold. She says it makes things clearer. Margaret sat down across from her. "She says that—" "On the porch," Lily said. "She goes out there when she's thinking. She says cold air is honest." Margaret was quiet for a moment, studying Lily with an expression that Daniel, standing in the hallway having heard voices and come to investigate, couldn't quite see, but would later describe to himself as someone seeing something they'd been waiting a long time to find. "Your Emily is a wise woman," Margaret said. Lily nodded seriously. "She's the best person I know," she said. "After Dad. And also after Mrs. Patterson at school. But Mrs. Patterson doesn't live here, so I think that's different." Margaret laughed again, pressed her hand to her mouth, composed herself. Daniel stood in the hallway and did not walk in yet. "Do you like having her here?" Margaret asked. Lily thought about it. "She makes everything better," she said. "Like before the house was fine. But now it's like when you turn the lights on. It's the same house, but you can see it." Margaret Brooks sat very still. "That's a beautiful thing to say," she said finally, her voice slightly uneven. "I know," said Lily with the calm confidence of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned that some truths are difficult to say out loud and is therefore simply saying them. "I told Emily that too. She cried a little. She said she was just tired." Margaret said. Daniel finally walked into the kitchen, because if he stood in that hallway another 30 seconds, he was going to have a problem with his own composure. And Daniel Carter did not have problems with his composure in hallways. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," Margaret said, looking at him with those wet, steady eyes. He poured himself coffee and sat beside his daughter and said nothing. But something had finished shifting. Something that had been moving underground for longer than he had names. For something was done moving and had arrived somewhere. He reached over and fixed the collar on Lily's pajama top, which had gone sideways. She didn't look up from her juice. She leaned slightly into his arm. Across the table, Margaret Brooks watched them and said nothing at all. And in the spare bedroom at the end of the hall, Emily Brooks was lying awake, listening to the sounds of her family in the kitchen. In the house that she had been calling Daniel's house for 2 years, wondering when she had started calling it something else inside her own head. Wondering when home had stopped being a place she was visiting and started being a place she was afraid to lose. Sunday brunch was Margaret Brooks at full operational capacity. That was the only way Daniel could describe it afterward. The woman had been in his kitchen for less than 18 hours, and she had already located every pan, reorganized his spice shelf in a way that somehow made more sense than the original arrangement, and produced a spread of food that made his dining table look like something from a magazine he would never buy, but would absolutely stop and stare at in a waiting room. She worked the way women of a certain generation work, constantly, cheerfully, and with a total refusal to accept help that paradoxically made everyone around her feel guilty enough to hover uselessly in the kitchen doorway. Robert Brooks sat at the table reading. Lily sat beside him, watching with the intense focus she usually reserved for cartoons, occasionally offering opinions on the relative merits of sausage versus bacon that Robert received with complete seriousness. Daniel stood at the counter and drank his coffee and tried to look like a man who was engaged to the woman cooking eggs on his stove. He was discovering that this required less acting than he expected. That was the part that kept catching him. He had prepared himself the night before for the work of it, the conscious effort of performing a closeness he didn't feel. He had run through the mechanics in his head, the way he ran through logistics problems at work, identifying the gaps, planning the coverage. But Sunday morning had arrived, and the mechanics weren't necessary because the closeness was simply already there, already visible to anyone looking. He didn't have to manufacture the way he watched Emily move through the kitchen. He didn't have to invent the small coordinations the way she handed him the coffee carafe without him asking, the way he automatically pulled out her chair before he pulled out his own. These were real things. He had simply never cataloged them before. "Daniel," Margaret said without turning from the stove. "How do you take your eggs?" "However they come," he said. "A man who doesn't make demands," Margaret said. "Emily, you did well." Emily, who was slicing bread at the counter 3 feet away, made a sound that was technically a laugh, but functioned more as a pressure valve releasing. "Thanks, Mom," she said. "Your father made demands." Margaret continued, as if this were a perfectly reasonable conversational direction. "First 5 years of our marriage, he wanted his eggs exactly one way. I told him I was a wife, not a short-order cook." She paused. "He came around." "He did," Robert confirmed from the table without looking up from his paper. 38 years, Margaret said. "And now he eats them however they come." "Adaptation," Robert said. "Love," Margaret corrected. Lily looked between them with the expression she wore when adults said things she was filing away to think about later. Daniel recognized the look because it was the same expression she wore when she was doing long division, total internal concentration, with a surface appearance of mild vacancy. "Ms. Margaret," Lily said. "Yes, sweetheart." "Did you always know you loved Mr. Robert?" The kitchen went briefly quiet. Robert Brooks lowered his newspaper approximately 2 inches. Margaret set her spatula down and turned around fully, which she had not done once in the 20 minutes she'd been cooking, and looked at Lily with an expression that cycled through several things before landing on something warm and slightly wondering. "No," Margaret said. "Not always." "When did you know?" Margaret thought about it. Actually thought about it, which Daniel respected. She didn't reach for the comfortable answer, the rehearsed one. "There was a night," Margaret said, "when I was very sick. Terrible flu. Fever chills the whole production. And I woke up at 3 in the morning, and Robert was sitting in the chair beside the bed reading. He wasn't asleep. He had just decided to sit with me through it." She paused. "I hadn't asked him to. He just did it because it was the right thing to do. And I looked at him in that chair, and I thought, this man has decided that my discomfort is his business, and that was it." The kitchen was quiet. "That's when you knew?" Lily asked. "That's when I knew," Margaret said. Lily absorbed this with the gravity of someone being handed important information. Then she looked at Daniel. "Dad," she said, "is that how you knew about Emily?" Daniel felt the question land directly in the center of his chest. Across the counter, Emily had gone very still. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on Lily, and he made a decision in the space of approximately 1 second. Not to perform, not to construct, but to simply say the true thing. "Something like that," he said. Lily nodded, satisfied. She turned back to Robert's newspaper, apparently deciding this topic was resolved. Emily resumed slicing bread. Daniel drank his coffee, and Margaret Brooks turned back to the stove, and he couldn't see her face, but he saw her shoulders, and something in them had settled. That was the moment Daniel would think later, when the weekend stopped being a performance. Not because the deception ended, it hadn't, but because the material they were working with had stopped being fabricated. They had crossed some invisible threshold from pretending to simply not hiding. Those were different things. He understood that now in a way he hadn't 24 hours ago. The understanding made him considerably less comfortable, not more. Brunch proceeded. Diane and Roxanne arrived from their hotel at 10:30, with bakery pastries and the specific social energy of 2 women who had spent the previous evening discussing Daniel Carter extensively, and had arrived with agendas they were barely concealing. Roxanne, the more direct of the 2, sat across from him at the table, and asked him within 11 minutes of arrival what his intentions were. Not about Emily. She asked it more broadly about life in general, which was technically less confrontational, but somehow more demanding. "My intention is to raise my kid and do right by the people in my life," Daniel said. Roxanne studied him. "That's a politician's answer." "That's a tired man's answer," Daniel said. "It's the same thing but less calculated." Roxanne laughed, a real one caught off guard. She looked at Emily. "I like him," she said. "I know," Emily said. "You could have led with that," Roxanne said. I thought you'd want to verify it yourself, Emily said. The look that passed between them, Emily and Roxanne, was the look of women who have known each other long enough that entire conversations happen in a single glance. Daniel caught the edges of it without catching the center, but he understood its general shape relief and something complicated, and a question that Roxanne was asking without words that Emily was answering with a slight lift of her chin. He didn't ask what the question was. Some things weren't his to know yet. Diane, who had been quieter than Roxanne across the table, leaned toward him during a lull and said at a volume that was technically private, but clearly designed to be overheard. She talked about you before she admitted she was talking about you. Daniel looked at her. What does that mean? She'd call me, Diane said, and she'd say, I'm having a weird week. And I'd ask why. And she'd start talking about something that happened at home. Something Daniel did. Something Lily said. Something about dinner or the porch or a conversation. She paused. It took me 6 months to realize the person she was telling me about, and the person she kept calling my roommate, were the same man. Daniel said nothing. She made herself very small around you, Diane said. I want you to know that, so you can understand what this weekend means to her. Made herself small how? Daniel asked. Diane considered her words. Emily has a habit, she said, of deciding in advance that she isn't what someone is looking for, before they even have a chance to look. She picked up her coffee cup. It's a very efficient way of never getting hurt. It is also a very efficient way of never getting anything you actually want. The table noise continued around them. Robert was talking to Phil about something. Lily was showing Carol the card game. Margaret was in the kitchen doing something unnecessary, because Margaret was always doing something unnecessary. Why are you telling me this? Daniel asked. Diane looked at him steadily. Because she would never tell you herself, she said. And because you seem like a man who needs to be told what's in front of him. She picked up her pastry and turned back to the general conversation, apparently done. Daniel sat with that for the rest of brunch. The afternoon moved the way. Sunday afternoons move when a house is full of people who are getting comfortable with each other, slowly, conversationally, with the low productive hum of humans in proximity to one another, choosing to be present. Robert and Daniel ended up in the backyard, which was how Daniel found himself at 2:30 on a Sunday afternoon in October, standing beside a 63-year-old man he had met yesterday, and talking about things he had not talked about with most people he'd known for years. Robert Brooks was not a man who warmed up gradually. He was a man who waited until he was ready to speak, and then simply spoke. She didn't date much, Robert said. Emily, growing up. Okay, Daniel said. Not because she wasn't remarkable, Robert said. She was always remarkable. Anyone with eyes could see it. But she had a way of anticipating rejection so effectively that she would disqualify herself before anyone else had the chance. He paused. Her mother and I worried about that for years. The preemptive flinch. He said those 2 words like they were clinical, like he had named it carefully and thought about it often. I recognize it, Daniel said before he could decide not to. Robert looked at him sidelong. My daughter, Daniel said. After the divorce. She started doing it too. Getting very quiet before social situations. Bracing herself. I had to learn to see it for what it was instead of just fixing the surface of it. Robert nodded slowly. You're a better father than you give yourself credit for, Robert said. I'm a father who's learning, Daniel said. Same thing, Robert said. Better than a man who stopped. They were quiet for a moment. I want to ask you something directly, Robert said. You can tell me it's none of my business. Go ahead, Daniel said. My daughter has spent her whole life waiting for someone to choose her without conditions, Robert said. Not despite her size, not despite her history, not despite whatever story she's told herself about her own value. Just choose her. Clearly. Completely. He looked at Daniel directly. Are you that man? The question was the most straightforward thing anyone had said to him in years. No ceremony around it. No softening. Daniel thought about the Sunday morning story he'd told at the table yesterday. The one he'd said he hadn't made up. I'm working on being that man, he said. That's the most honest answer I have. Robert studied him for a long time. Honest answers are the only ones worth giving, he said finally. The men who come to me with certainty I don't trust. Certainty is a costume. He looked back at the yard. Working on it is real. He clapped Daniel once on the shoulder, firm, brief, the kind of contact that communicates something too large for words, and then he walked back toward the house. Daniel stood alone in the yard. He stood there for a while. Working on it, he had said. He had not said it as a performance. He had said it because it was true, and because Robert Brooks was a man who would have seen the difference. The trouble with telling true things to people who listen carefully is that they have a way of making those things more real. Daniel had said working on it as an honest description of where he currently stood, and somewhere in the act of saying it to a man who received it as fact, it had become a direction. He hadn't intended that. I went back inside. The afternoon continued. Phil fell asleep on the couch at 3 o'clock and snored through an impressive television program about deep-sea fishing. Carol taught Lily a recipe for Mexican hot chocolate that Lily immediately announced would be her new specialty. Roxanne found Daniel's modest bookshelf and started asking pointed questions about his reading habits that turned into a 40-minute conversation he had not expected to enjoy as much as he did. And Emily moved through all of it, through every room, every conversation, every small collision of personalities that makes up an afternoon with a family, with a lightness that Daniel had not seen from her before. That was the word for it. Lightness. She was funny, in a way she didn't usually allow herself in company. The dry, quick humor she deployed sometimes in the kitchen late at night, when it was just the two of them. The wit she usually kept on a lower setting in groups. She told a story about a client who had wanted their entire house decorated in the color of a specific brand of honey mustard, and she had everyone laughing so hard that Phil woke up. Briefly, looked around, concluded he had missed something important, and went back to sleep. She sat close to Daniel on the couch, and it didn't feel staged. She passed him things without thinking about it. She leaned over at one point and said something quiet near his ear about Carol's sweater, something private and mildly irreverent, and he laughed under his breath. And when he turned his head, she was right there, and for one suspended second, neither of them moved. And then Lily dropped something across the room, and the moment dissolved. But it had existed. That was the thing. It had been a real moment in real space, not constructed, not managed, not performed for an audience. Diane across the room was looking at her phone, and not at them, but Daniel noticed that she was smiling. By 5 o'clock, the house was moving into the gear of a Sunday evening, people gathering their things, coordinating departure times, the slightly melancholy activity of a gathering winding down. Diane and Roxanne were leaving for the drive back to Pueblo. Carol and Phil were heading to their hotel. Robert and Margaret were staying the last night. They had a long drive back to Phoenix in the morning, but the afternoon's full assembly was dispersing. The goodbyes took time. They always did with families. Roxanne hugged Emily for a long time and said something into her hair that Daniel couldn't hear. When they separated, Emily's eyes were slightly bright. Roxanne then turned to Daniel, looked at him for a full 3 seconds and said, "Don't wait too long to be sure about things. Sure is overrated. Present is what matters." Daniel opened his mouth. Roxanne walked past him to the door. Diane paused beside him on her way out and said simply, "She's been braver than she looks this weekend. I hope you're paying attention." "I am," Daniel said, and then they were gone. Carol and Phil left shortly after, Carol pressing both of Daniel's hands between hers before she walked out and telling him he had a beautiful family. A statement that landed on him with a complexity he didn't have time to examine because she was already at the door. And then it was just the 6 of them. Daniel, Emily, Lily, and Emily's parents in a house that was suddenly much quieter. Margaret proposed tea. Robert was already reading again. Lily commandeered Margaret to finish a drawing project that had apparently been discussed and agreed upon earlier in the day without Daniel's awareness. And Emily disappeared into the kitchen to handle the remains of the afternoon, and Daniel followed her because he was running out of reasons not to. She was at the sink. He picked up a dish towel without being asked. They worked in silence for a minute. "You doing okay?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "In a good way, I think." "Your dad and I talked," Daniel said. Emily's hands slowed slightly on the pan she was scrubbing. I figured you would. He asked me if I was the right man for you. She was quiet. What did you say? She asked. Her voice was careful, the way her voice got when she was paying very close attention to something. I said I was working on it, Daniel said. Emily set the pan down. She turned off the faucet. She turned to look at him, and he saw something move through her face. Not surprise exactly, and not happiness, in the simple, uncomplicated way, but something deeper and more careful, something that had been very well protected for a long time, and was deciding slowly whether to come out into the open. Daniel, she said. I know the weekend isn't over, he said. And I know we haven't talked about what happens after. I know there are things we need to figure out. There are a lot of things, she said. I know that too. He folded the dish towel and set it on the counter. I'm just telling you what I said to your father wasn't part of the performance. She looked at him for a long time. The kitchen clock made its sound. From the living room came the murmur of Lily explaining her art project with the earnest enthusiasm of a child who takes creative work seriously. I'm scared, Emily said. So am I, Daniel said. That doesn't fix anything. No, he said. It doesn't. But it means we're both working with the same information. She looked down at her hands, back up at him. And then something in her face did the thing that faces do when a decision has been made below the conscious level and the rest of the person is catching up to it. A softening, a releasing so small that only someone paying very close attention would have seen it. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They went back to the dishes. But something had been said, and it could not be unsaid, and both of them knew it, and neither of them was sorry. Margaret Brooks appeared in the kitchen doorway. 7 minutes later, looked at the two of them, working side by side, and went back to the living room without saying a word. But she was smiling. That night after Lily was in bed and Robert and Margaret had said their goodnights and the house had gone quiet. In the way it went quiet specifically at the end of long weekends, Daniel sat at the kitchen table alone with a cup of coffee that had gone cold without him noticing. I was not thinking about Monday, though Monday was coming. He was not thinking about the logistics of what happened next, though there were logistics. He was thinking about a word. Home. Lily had used it. Not the word itself. She'd said something about lights about the same house but visible now. But she had been describing the specific phenomenon of a space becoming more than a structure. The process by which 4 walls and a roof absorb the presence of the right people and become something that cannot be replicated by floor plans or square footage. Daniel had owned this house for 4 years. He had thought of it as his house, his responsibility, the place where he raised his daughter and paid his mortgage and existed between shifts. He had not thought of it as a home, not clearly, not in the way that word was supposed to mean. He was thinking about when that had changed. I was thinking about the answer, which was not a date, but a gradual accumulation of small things he had been cataloging without knowing. He was cataloging them, filed away in some part of him that had been paying close attention even when the rest of him was busy performing indifference. The kitchen light was on. From down the hall came the sound of the spare bedroom door, very quiet, and then nothing. Emily turning in for the night. He sat for another minute. Then he got up, rinsed his cup, turned off the kitchen light, and walked down the hall. He stopped for just a moment outside the spare bedroom door. Just 1 second. He didn't knock. There was nothing to say tonight that hadn't already been said. But he stood there in the dark hallway and acknowledged something to himself plainly and without ceremony. He was not performing. He had not been performing, he thought, for most of the weekend. The question now was, what you did with that. What you did with the true thing, when the fiction that revealed it was still technically in place, when the family in the guest room believed a story that wasn't a lie anymore, but wasn't yet the full truth either. When the woman on the other side of the door had said she was scared, and he had said he was too, and they had agreed to be scared together without quite agreeing to anything else yet. He walked to his room. He lay in the dark. Monday was coming, and Monday would require him to make a choice. Not the choice of the weekend, the managed, surviving choice of a man, helping someone he cared about through a difficult situation, but a real one. The kind made by a man who had decided that the person in front of him was worth it regardless of the risk. The kind Robert Brooks had described in the backyard. The kind that didn't wait for certainty, because certainty was a costume and present was what mattered. He lay there and did not sleep for a long time. And down the hall behind a closed door, Emily Brooks lay in the dark as well, listening to the quiet sounds of a house that she had been calling someone else's for 2 years, and she was making her own inventory of risk, of hope, of the particular courage required to want something loudly, after spending years wanting it quietly, so no one could see her wanting it and find her insufficient. She was afraid. She had told him that, and he had said he was afraid too. She had spent most of her life believing that when she told the truth about her fear, people would use it as confirmation of what they already suspected, that she was too much, too complicated, too risky an investment for anyone willing to do the math. Daniel had not done that. He had just said he was afraid too, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Like fear was not a reason to leave, but simply a condition of being human and present and alive to the weight of what you were building. She pulled the blanket up. She closed her eyes. And in the guest room down the hall, Margaret Brooks lay awake beside her husband and thought about her daughter, and thought about the man in this house, and thought about the specific way a woman moves through a space when she feels safe in it, freely, easily, without the small invisible contractions that happen when a person is always bracing. Emily had moved through this house freely. Margaret had noticed. She had noticed from the moment she walked in. She had noticed, and she had cried, and then she had composed herself and made pancakes and asked no questions. She didn't already know the answers to, because Margaret Brooks had been watching her daughter for 30 years, and she knew the shape of Emily's happiness, the way she knew her own heartbeat. She reached for Robert's hand in the dark. He was already awake. He took her hand without a word. "She's going to be all right," Margaret whispered. "Yes," Robert said. "She is." They lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around them, and neither of them said the other thing. They were both thinking the thing too large and too precious to say out loud on a Sunday night in someone else's house. That all the years of worry, all the holidays and the phone calls and the careful, loving, sometimes clumsy pressure had not been about whether Emily was worthy of love. They had always known she was. The worry had been about whether she would ever let herself believe it. And now, in this house, in this particular quiet, with a man down the hall who said, "I'm working on it," like it was a promise, and a daughter who said, Emily made the lights come on. Margaret Brooks thought for the first time in a very long time that maybe her girl was finally starting to believe it. She held her husband's hand. She let herself breathe. Monday would come, and with it, everything that Monday carried. But tonight in the dark, in this house that smelled like pot roast and late October, and someone's entire life rearranging itself into something better tonight, was enough. Monday arrived the way Daniel had known it would, without mercy and without ceremony, the way all reckonings do. I was up at 5:30. Old habit, the kind that doesn't ask permission. He made coffee in the quiet before the house woke up and stood at the counter and thought about what the day required of him. Margaret and Robert would be leaving by 8. The fiction would walk out the door with them, at least in its current form. And then there would be just the two of them, he and Emily, and a conversation that had been building for 48 hours and could not be delayed past breakfast. He heard Robert before he saw him. The man moved quietly for his size, but the hallway floorboard outside the bathroom had a specific creak that Daniel knew by frequency, and he heard it at 6:10 and poured a second cup without being asked. Robert appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed unhurried with the self-contained stillness of a man who had long since made peace with early mornings. "You didn't sleep," Robert said. It was not a question. "Not much," Daniel said, and handed him the coffee. Robert took it and sat down at the table, and for a moment neither of them spoke, which was comfortable in the way that silences between certain men are comfortable, not empty, but shared. "She's going to push back," Robert said finally. Daniel looked at him. "Emily, she does it when things get real." Robert turned the cup in his hands. "She'll find a reason it doesn't work. She'll hand you a list of practical concerns. She's very good at practical concerns, and underneath every single item on that list is the same question." "What question?" Daniel asked. Robert looked at him steadily. "Whether you'll still be there when the practical concerns run out." Daniel absorbed that. "I'll still be there," he said. "Then tell her that," Robert said. "Directly. Don't let her build the exit before you've walked through the door." He drank his coffee. Daniel drank his. The house was still quiet around them, holding its breath. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said. "Go ahead." "When you sat in that chair," Daniel said, "the night Margaret was sick, did you know what it meant at the time, or did you figure it out after?" Robert thought about it. Really thought about it the same way Margaret had thought about Lily's question, refusing the easy answer. "I think," Robert said slowly, "that I knew exactly what it meant and told myself I was just being practical." He paused. "Men do that. We dress up our feelings in practical clothing so they're easier to carry around." Daniel nodded once. "The coat was already practical," Robert said. "It was the sitting there all night that was the feeling." He finished his coffee and stood up, and he clapped Daniel on the shoulder, the same way he had in the backyard, brief, firm, communicating the large thing in the smallest possible gesture, and then he went to wake Margaret. Daniel sat alone at the table for a few minutes. He was thinking about practical clothing. I was thinking about all the practical reasons he had cataloged over 2 years for everything he had done for Emily, and everything he had noticed about Emily, and everything he had felt quietly and without announcement in the presence of Emily, and he was starting to understand that the practical explanations had always been the coat. The warmth underneath them was the thing he had been refusing to name. He was done refusing. That was the decision he had made, somewhere between midnight and 5:30 in the dark, listening to a house that had answered a question he hadn't quite known he was asking. He was done refusing. Now he had to figure out what to do with that. Margaret and Robert were ready to leave by 7:55, which Daniel suspected was deliberate on Robert's part. The man valued precision, and the timing of a departure was not exempt from that value. Margaret hugged Lily twice and slipped a $20 bill into her hand with the conspiratorial speed of a grandmother who knew exactly what she was doing and refused to apologize for it. She hugged Daniel once, the same long hug as Friday night, but this time when she pulled back, she held his face briefly in her hands, the gesture of a woman who had raised a daughter and knew how to communicate entire volumes without language, and then she let go and went to Emily. What passed between Emily and her mother in the foyer, Daniel didn't hear. He was in the kitchen giving them the space they needed. But he heard the register of it. Margaret's voice low and sustained the way it got when she was saying something important, and Emily's voice shorter, tighter, the way it got when she was trying not to cry in front of people. The front door opened, closed. Silence. Daniel came out of the kitchen. Emily was standing in the foyer with her back to him, her hand on the door. She stayed like that for a moment, not moving, not turning around. "Emily," he said. "Give me a second," she said. He waited. She took a breath that he could see from across the room. Then she turned around and her eyes were bright but dry. She had contained it the way she always contained things, pushing them somewhere manageable until later. "They're gone," she said. "I know. The weekend is over. I know that too," he said. She looked at him, and he saw the exact moment it began, the thing Robert had warned him about. The slight shift in her posture, the gathering of a different kind of energy. The eyes moving slightly sideways, the way eyes do when a mind starts building. "So I guess we need to talk about how we handle the fallout," she said. "Because my mother is going to call tomorrow and ask about a wedding date, and I need to have something to—" "Emily," Daniel said. "I'm thinking maybe we could say we want a long engagement, which gives me time to figure out how to—" "Emily." She stopped. "Stop building the exit," he said. The words landed visibly. She blinked. "What?" "Your father warned me," Daniel said. "He said you'd hand me a list of practical concerns, and I'm telling you right now that I don't want the list." He walked toward her, not fast, not slow, and stopped close enough that she couldn't look sideways anymore without looking at him directly. "I want to skip to the question underneath the list." Her jaw tightened slightly. "I'm not doing anything. I'm being practical." "I know you are," he said. "I know exactly what it looks like, and I know why you do it. And I'm asking you to stop. Just for a minute. Just long enough to hear what I'm about to say." She looked up at him. Her arms were crossed over her chest, the protective geometry of a woman waiting to be dismissed. He held her gaze. "The weekend isn't what changed something," he said. "The weekend just made me stop pretending something hadn't already changed. A long time ago, before Friday. You've been part of my life in a way that matters for 2 years, and I spent most of that time calling it convenient and calling it roommate and calling it any name that kept it at a distance where it couldn't scare me." She was very still. "I am scared," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I was scared when I was married, and I was scared when that ended, and I have been scared every single day since of letting anything matter again the way that mattered. Because I have the daughter, and her heart is in my hands, and I do not have the luxury of being reckless." Emily's arms dropped slightly. Not all the way, but slightly. "But I've been doing something wrong," Daniel said. "I've been treating careful and closed as the same thing, and they're not. Careful means you think about it. Closed means you refuse it before you've finished thinking." He exhaled. "I don't want to be closed anymore." The foyer was quiet. Emily was looking at him with the expression of someone who has prepared for 7 possible conversations and is realizing that none of them were this one. "Daniel," she said. Her voice was very careful. "You understand that this started as a lie," he said. "Yes. And that's a complicated foundation. Everything real is built on something that started complicated," he said. "Including Lily, including this house, including every good thing in my life." She was quiet. "I'm not asking you to make a decision right now," he said. "I'm asking you to stop deciding it can't work before it's had a chance to start." He looked at her steadily. "That's all I'm asking." The second hand moved around whatever clock was ticking somewhere in the house. Emily uncrossed her arms completely. "I have spent 30 years, she said slowly, "making myself smaller so the rejection would hurt less when it came." "I know," he said, "and it never actually hurt less. It just hurt earlier." "I know that too," he said. "So I need you to understand," she said, and her voice was doing the careful thing again, holding itself level at significant personal effort, "that what you're asking me to do is the single most terrifying thing anyone has ever asked me to do." "I know," he said, "and you're asking me to do it anyway." "Yes," he said. A long pause. "Okay," Emily said. He let out a breath. "Okay," she said again, like she was confirming it for herself. "But if you change your mind." "I won't," he said. "You don't know. Emily." He held her gaze. "I have been running the same house with you for 2 years. I know what I have. I know what it's worth." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she nodded once the way someone nods when they've made a decision that is irreversible, and they know it, and they're choosing it anyway. "Okay," she said for the 3rd time, and this time it sounded like the beginning of something. They stood in the foyer for a moment more, and then Lily's voice came from down the hall asking if there was cereal, and the spell broke cleanly, and they both moved toward the kitchen, and the day that was waiting, and it was ordinary, and it was real, and it was exactly right. 3 weeks passed. They were not 3 easy weeks. That was the part no one talks about when they tell love stories, the weeks that come after the decision, but before the solid ground. The weeks when you've chosen something, and you're certain of the choice, and you still have moments where the certainty dissolves at 3 in the morning and leaves you lying in the dark, asking yourself whether you've made a catastrophic mistake. Daniel had those moments. He recognized them for what they were, not evidence against the decision, but the predictable difficulty of a man rewiring himself after years of practiced distance, and he moved through them without acting on them, which was all you could do. Emily had them too. He could tell. She had a specific way of going quiet in the evenings. Not the comfortable quiet they'd always shared, but a different kind. A thinner kind, where he could see her working through something behind her eyes. On those evenings, he'd sit near her without pressing, and sometimes she'd talk, and sometimes she wouldn't, and either way, it was all right. And he thought that might be the truest definition of real partnership. He had encountered the ability to be present with another person's silence, without making it about yourself. What they were building was slow and careful and full of small adjustments. They were learning the new language of what they were to each other, which was different from the old language. even though it sounded similar from the outside. The same coffee in the morning, the same coordination around Lily's schedule, the same house, the same routines, but underneath all of it, a different current. Warm and slightly electric and carrying more weight. Lily noticed. Of course, Lily noticed. Children notice everything that adults think they're concealing, and nothing that adults think they're communicating clearly, which makes them the most accurate instruments available for reading domestic weather. She didn't say anything directly for the first week. She observed in her careful 7-year-old way, and she filed things, and she waited. And then one evening at dinner, with the particular timing that Lily had for dropping important things into ordinary moments, she looked up from her pasta and said, "Are you and Emily going to get actually married?" Daniel put his fork down. Across the table, Emily went extremely still. "What makes you ask that?" Daniel said. Lily shrugged the elaborate casual shrug of a child who has thought very carefully about something and is pretending she hasn't. "You're different," she said. "Since Ms. Margaret and Mr. Robert were here, you look at each other different." "Different how?" Emily asked. Lily thought about it. "Before you looked at each other like you were being polite," she said. "Now you look at each other like you mean it." Daniel and Emily did not look at each other, which was of course its own kind of answer. "Would that bother you?" Daniel asked. "If things between Emily and me became different?" Lily looked at him with the frank patience of a child being asked a question whose answer is obvious. "Dad," she said, "I literally told Ms. Margaret that Emily makes the lights come on." Daniel pressed his hand briefly over his mouth. "I'm just saying," Lily said, returning to her pasta, "that it would be fine with me." Emily reached for her water glass and drank from it, and Daniel noticed that her hand was not quite steady. "Good to know," Daniel said. "Also," Lily added with the afterthought energy of someone delivering a grenade, "Izzy at school has a stepmom, and she says it's actually really good because it's like having an extra mom, but she also likes your regular mom, so I asked her, and she said the math works out." Emily made a sound that was half laugh, half something else entirely. "The math works out," Daniel repeated. "According to Izzy." Lily confirmed and finished her pasta. That was the moment Daniel would think later. Not the foyer conversation, not the porch, not Sunday morning coffee, or the story about the engagement that wasn't. It was the dinner table, and a 7-year-old girl eating pasta and delivering the most matter-of-fact blessing he had ever received, and Emily reaching for a water glass with an unsteady hand. That was the moment the fear finally started to have less square footage than the wanting. Then the call came. It arrived on a Tuesday evening, 3.5 weeks after the weekend, and it arrived not from Margaret, which Daniel had been anticipating, but from someone he hadn't calculated at all. Emily's ex-boyfriend. His name was Marcus, and Daniel knew about him only in the way you know about the geography of someone's past. The shape of it. The significant features without the lived detail. Emily had mentioned him once briefly in the context of explaining why she had certain habits, the preemptive smallness, the constructed exits. Marcus had apparently been thorough in his confirmation of Emily's fears. A long relationship that had ended with him telling her with what she had described as genuine bewilderment, rather than cruelty, that he just couldn't see himself with someone who looked the way she looked. Not forever. He wasn't built for it. She had told Daniel this on a Tuesday night 8 months ago. Matter-of-factly, the way you relay information that has been processed and filed, and can now be discussed without damage. He had listened and said nothing useful, because there was nothing useful to say. And afterward, she had made tea, and they had watched something forgettable on television, and that had been the end of it. He had not thought about Marcus since. He thought about him now. Emily took the call in her bedroom with the door closed, and Daniel knew who it was because she came out of the kitchen the moment her phone rang. Walked quickly down the hall, and he heard her say the name. Quiet surprised a single word heard before the door closed. He stayed in the kitchen. He did the thing that responsible adults in nascent relationships do, which is to wait without catastrophizing and trust the other person to handle their own life. And he managed this for approximately 9 minutes before he found himself standing in the hallway outside her door. Not listening, but present, which was a distinction that mattered to him, even if it wouldn't have mattered to anyone else. He heard her voice, but not the words. The register of it, that was what he could read. And the register was careful and slightly tight, and held at a distance the same distance she had once held everything. The call lasted 14 minutes. When the door opened and she appeared, she looked at him standing in the hallway, and she didn't look surprised. "Marcus," she said. "I know," he said. "He saw something," she said. "Online. One of my cousins posted something about the weekend. A photo." Daniel waited. He wanted to. She stopped. Started again. "He said he was reaching out to see how I was." That's how he phrased it. To see how I was. She looked at the wall briefly. What he actually said once we'd gotten through the seeing how I was portion was that he was surprised. That he hadn't thought that he didn't think someone would choose you, Daniel said. She looked at him. That's what he was actually saying, Daniel said. He was surprised someone chose you. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. More or less. The anger that moved through Daniel was quiet and thorough and entirely private. He kept it that way. What did you say to him? Daniel asked. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face was working through a final calculation, the last decimal place of a decision she had been approaching for weeks. I said, she told him that I was surprised too, at first. She paused. And then I said that I had stopped being surprised and started being grateful, which is better. That's all, Daniel said. And then I hung up, she said. Daniel looked at her. Good, he said. Yeah, Emily said. She stood in the hallway, and he stood in the hallway, and the house was quiet around them, and then she moved past him toward the kitchen and said, I'm making tea, in the tone of someone returning to solid ground, and he followed her because that was what he did. The tea was chamomile. She made 2 cups without asking. They sat at the kitchen table with the overhead light on the one Daniel never turned on because it made the room feel like an interrogation room, and it occurred to him that it didn't feel like an interrogation room anymore. It just felt like light. Can I say something? Daniel asked. You're going to anyway, Emily said. Marcus was wrong, Daniel said. Not tactically, not socially, wrong. About what you are, about what you're worth. And the fact that it took you this long to have someone tell you that clearly that's on every person who should have said it and didn't. Emily held her cup. I'm telling you now, he said. Clearly, without subtext. He leaned forward slightly. You are not hard to love, Emily. You are not a consolation prize. You are not someone a man settles for. You are the thing he's been walking toward without knowing it, and then arrives at and realizes the walking was the point. The kitchen was very quiet. That's a lot, Emily said. Her voice was not quite steady. I know, he said. I mean all of it. She looked at her tea. Back at him. Something in her face was doing the final thing, the irreversible softening the opening that can't be closed again once it happens. I don't know how to just receive that, she said. I don't have practice. I know, he said. So practice now. She almost smiled. Almost. That's not how it works. That's exactly how it works, he said. You do the thing until you know how to do the thing. She did smile, then small and real, and a little undone around the edges. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They drank their tea. The thing about rebuilding something you've broken in yourself, whether it's trust or hope, or the simple willingness to believe that good things can happen to you, and stay, is that it doesn't happen in a single conversation at a kitchen table. It happens in the accumulation of mornings where the good thing is still there. It happens in the evidence gathered slowly that the world is not going to snatch the thing away the moment you stop bracing. Daniel understood this because he had been rebuilding the same thing in himself on a parallel track for the same amount of time. They were, he thought, working on it together, separately and simultaneously, and with the particular clumsiness of 2 people who are very capable in most areas of their lives and thoroughly inexperienced in this one. It was not smooth. There was an evening in the 4th week where Emily said something sharp and he said something shuddered, and they went to bed having resolved nothing, and the next morning was thick with the particular residue of arguments that haven't been finished, and it took until noon and a phone call from Lily's school about a permission slip, the specific mundane emergency of parenthood, to cut through it. And afterward, Emily said without preamble, "I said something mean last night because I was scared, not because I meant it." And Daniel said, "I know, and I went cold instead of staying in it, which is my thing." And that was the end of it. Not perfectly resolved. Just passed through. Survived. Intact on the other side. That was a week 4. Week 5 brought a different kind of test. It arrived in the form of a phone call that Daniel took at work, and the voice on the other end was female and familiar, and produced an immediate cold clarity at the base of his spine. His ex-wife, Claire. She didn't call often. They had achieved over 5 years the particular careful civility of two people who had done each other significant damage and had agreed for the sake of their daughter to be functional. It wasn't warm. It was workable. That was enough. The call was about Lily's upcoming school concert logistics calendar coordination, the neutral administrative exchange that most of their contact consisted of. And then at the end, almost as an afterthought, "I heard you're seeing someone." Daniel went still. "Where did you hear that?" "Lily mentioned it," Claire said. "She talks about Emily a lot, actually." He waited. "She sounds—" Claire paused. "She sounds good for Lily." "She is," Daniel said. Another pause. "Is it serious?" Claire asked. He thought about the foyer, the kitchen table, the chamomile tea, the 14-minute phone call, the morning after the argument where they had come back to each other without ceremony. "Yes," he said. A long pause on her end. "Not hostile. Something more complicated than hostile." "Good," Claire said finally. "I mean that Daniel, I know it doesn't—" She stopped. "I know we didn't end in a way that lets me say things easily, but I mean it. Lily deserves a full house." "Yeah," Daniel said. "She does." The call ended. He sat at his desk for a moment with his phone in his hand. He thought about the word full. He thought about Lily's face at dinner, matter of fact, and certain delivering the blessing without drama. He thought about the specific weight of a house that had become home not through grand events, but through the uncountable small ones. He picked up his phone and texted Emily. The text said, "Dinner tonight. Just us and Lily. I'm cooking." She replied 40 seconds later, "You cook 4 things." He replied, "Pick one." She replied with a pasta emoji. He put his phone away and went back to work, and for the first time in longer than he could precisely remember. Going back to work felt like moving towards something rather than away from it. Emily was in the kitchen when he got home, helping Lily with homework in the specific way she helped Lily with homework, not doing it for her, but asking questions until Lily arrived at the answer herself, a Socratic patience that Daniel had noted and admired and never quite managed himself. He stood in the doorway for a moment watching. Lily was explaining fractions with the concentration of a surgeon. Emily was nodding at exactly the right frequency, asking the exactly right next question. On the table between them were the homework worksheet, 3 colored pencils, and a bowl of the crackers that Lily required during all serious intellectual endeavors. Daniel walked in, kissed the top of Lily's head, and went to the stove. Nobody made a production of it. Nobody narrated the moment. It was just a Tuesday evening in a kitchen, and 3 people moving through it with the easy coordination of a family that had been finding its shape. He cooked pasta. They ate. Lily talked about fractions and a girl named Becca who could do a cartwheel with her eyes closed, and whether it was possible to train a hamster using only positive reinforcement. Emily said she thought positive reinforcement was probably the correct framework for most living things. Lily looked at Daniel. "Is that how you trained me?" "I prefer to think of it as collaborative goal setting," Daniel said. Lily stared at him. "Dad." "Yes. That's the same thing." Emily laughed. Daniel laughed. Lily returned to her pasta, satisfied that she had won whatever this was. And that was the evening. No declaration. No ceremony. No moment that announced itself as significant. But Daniel would carry it. He would carry the specific weight of that Tuesday evening, the pasta, the fractions, the cartwheel, the laughter for years, pulling it out sometimes when he needed to remember what he was building and why the building was worth it. It was not a grand moment, it was a true one. And by the time they had cleared the table, and Lily was in the bath, and the kitchen was quiet, Daniel understood something he had been circling for weeks without landing on. The decision wasn't a single decision. It never was. It was a daily one, the same choice made again every morning to stay present to the good thing. To resist the old habit of managed distance, to let what mattered keep mattering without building walls around it. He was making that choice. So was she. And somehow, in the daily repetition of it, something that had started as pretending had become the most real thing in his life. He turned off the kitchen light. He went to check on Lily. He passed the door of the spare bedroom that was not really a spare bedroom anymore, in the way it was not really Emily's room anymore, in any of the ways that word suggested distance, and he stopped for a moment, the old ritual, the pause before the door. But this time, what he felt on the other side of that pause was not the managed bracing of a man keeping something at arm's length. It was something warmer, something that had been there for a long time, waiting for him to stop calling it something practical. He kept walking. Down the hall, Lily was singing to herself in the bath, some song she had invented that had no discernible melody, but considerable emotional range. He stood outside the bathroom door and listened. And the house held them, all three of them, in its particular quiet, the quiet of a place that has finally fully become what it was always supposed to be. 6 weeks after the weekend that changed everything, Daniel Carter made a mistake. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive with warning signs or a soundtrack. It arrived the way most real mistakes do, quietly dressed as something reasonable, in the middle of an ordinary Wednesday. He had been distracted at work. The logistics company was running a complicated audit, and his supervisor had added 3 new responsibilities to his plate, without removing any of the old ones. And Daniel had spent the week operating at the particular frequency of a man who is managing too many things, and starting to show the edges of it. He came home tired on Wednesday, and he came home to Emily on the phone in the kitchen, sitting at the table with her laptop open and her design sketches spread around her, laughing at something the person on the other end of the call was saying. The person on the other end was a man. A client, Daniel would later learn. A straightforward professional conversation about a project Emily had been developing for 3 months. Completely unremarkable. But in the specific exhaustion of that Wednesday, Daniel heard her laughing, and something old moved in him, something from a different chapter. A chapter he thought he had closed, and before he could examine it, he walked through the kitchen without stopping, without making eye contact, without the usual small acknowledgement that had become the grammar of their shared space. He went to his room and closed the door. Not slammed. Closed. Which was worse somehow. Emily noticed. Of course she noticed. She noticed the way she noticed everything about the house immediately, precisely, and with the particular attention of someone who had learned to read the weather of a space very carefully. She finished her call. She closed her laptop. She sat at the table for 2 minutes, which Daniel would not know until later, doing her own internal accounting. Then she got up and knocked on his door. "Come in," he said. She opened the door and leaned against the frame and looked at him with the steady, careful expression that she had developed over the past 6 weeks. For exactly these moments. The expression that said, "I see you, and I am not going anywhere, and I need you to tell me the truth." "What happened?" she said. "Long day," Daniel said. "Daniel." He looked at the ceiling briefly, back at her. "Who were you talking to?" A pause. Emily's eyebrows shifted, not much, just a fraction. The small seismic movement of someone registering something unexpected. "Client," she said. "Whitmore Project. The guy in Boulder who wants the open concept renovation." Daniel said nothing. "You heard me laughing," Emily said. It was not a question. "I'm not..." He stopped. "I'm not saying anything." "You're saying something," Emily said. "You're just not using words." He stood up from the bed and walked to the window and stood with his back to her, which was a thing he did when he needed a moment and did not want to be watched doing it. He knew it was a bad habit. He knew it communicated the wrong thing. He did it anyway. "Daniel." Her voice was quiet, not angry. something more measured. "Look at me." He turned around. "I need you to say what you're thinking," she said, out loud. "Because if you don't, I will fill in the blank myself, and I will fill it in wrong, and then we will have a fight about the wrong thing." He looked at her. The exhaustion of the week, the specific weight of old fears, wearing new clothing. He felt all of it in the 5 seconds of silence between them. "I heard a man's voice," he said finally, "and something in me reacted, before I could think about it." He exhaled. "And I know that's mine to deal with. I know it's not about you. But I also didn't manage it well, and I'm aware of that." Emily was quiet for a moment. "Claire," she said. He blinked. "What?" "This is about Claire," Emily said. "Not me, not the phone call. This is about what happened last time you trusted someone with the thing that mattered most to you, and what that cost you." She paused. "I'm not her." "I know you're not," he said. "But some part of you is still running the old software," she said. "And I need you to know I see that. I'm not offended by it. But I need you to come to me when it runs, not go to your room and close the door." Something in his chest shifted. "I'm not used to doing that." "I know," she said. "Practice." He recognized his own word. She had returned it to him with quiet precision, and the corner of his mouth moved in spite of itself. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know," she said again. "Come have dinner." She turned and walked back to the kitchen, and he stood for a moment alone in his room, and did the rapid internal work of a man dismantling something that should have come down years ago. He followed her. Lily was already at the table with her homework, and did not look up when he came in, but she moved her backpack off his chair without being asked, which was her version of welcome home. They ate. The conversation was ordinary. The evening repaired itself. But later. Lying in the dark. Daniel understood that the repair had required something from Emily that she shouldn't have had to give the labor of staying present in the face of his withdrawal. The effort of interpreting him charitably when she had every right to interpret him otherwise. That was something he had to stop putting on her. He would do better. Heimat himself that specific private commitment before he went to sleep. Not a dramatic one, just a man deciding to be more than his old habits allowed. 3 days later, on a Saturday, 7 weeks after the weekend, Lily got sick. Not seriously. The 24-hour variety, the kind that arrives without announcement and departs just as abruptly, leaving behind nothing except a pale child and a pile of laundry. But she was sick enough that Daniel had canceled his Saturday plans, and Emily had rearranged her own schedule without being asked. And by 11 in the morning, they had settled into the particular choreography of 2 people managing a sick child together. Daniel handled the medical components, temperature checks, the precise dosing of medication that he performed with pharmacist-level focus. The consultation of the pediatrician's after-hours line, when Lily's temperature spiked briefly to a number that activated every parental alarm he possessed. Emily handled everything else. The soup that appeared from the kitchen, with timing that suggested she had started it before anyone asked the specific blanket retrieved from Lily's closet, without prompting the quiet reading aloud from the book. Lily was currently obsessed with her voice even, and unhurried while Daniel stood in the doorway watching. At 2 in the afternoon, Lily fell asleep mid-chapter. Emily kept reading one more page, the whole page at the same quiet pace. And then she closed the book and set it carefully on the nightstand and stood up. She looked at Daniel in this doorway. "She's out," Emily said softly. "Yeah," he said. They moved to the kitchen because it was where they always moved the gravitational center of the house, and Emily poured 2 cups of coffee that she'd kept warm and handed him one, and they sat down across from each other and were quiet for a minute. "You're good at this," Daniel said. "Keeping coffee warm," Emily said. "The sick kid thing," he said. "You didn't hesitate. You didn't ask what to do. You just did." Emily wrapped her hands around her cup. "I've been doing it for 2 years, she said. "I know," he said. "But there's a difference between helping when it's convenient and showing up when it's difficult." He looked at her. "You showed up." "Of course I showed up," she said, like the alternative was incomprehensible. And that was it. That was the whole thing. The simplicity of it, of course, landed on Daniel with more force than a declaration would have, because declarations were designed to impress, and of course was something else entirely. Of course was a thing you said when showing up was so fundamental to who you were that alternatives didn't require serious consideration. He had been building a case, he realized. Not deliberately. But over these weeks, he had been gathering evidence Wednesday evenings, and Tuesday dinners, and 6 Saturdays, and today, the case was complete. He knew what he was going to do. He didn't say it that afternoon. The timing wasn't right. Lily was sick. The house was in recovery mode, and what he was planning deserved space, not a spare moment between temperature checks. But he knew. And once Daniel Carter knew something, he moved. He called Robert Brooks that evening. The call lasted 9 minutes. Robert asked 2 questions and made 3 statements, and at the end said, "You don't need my permission." And Daniel said, "I know. I wanted to tell you because you're the kind of man who should know." There was a pause on the line, and then Robert said, "Thank you for that." And his voice had something in it that Daniel hadn't heard from him before, something that required the man to clear his throat immediately after, for ostensibly unrelated reasons. He called Roxanne next, because Roxanne had been the one to say, "Don't wait too long," and she deserved to know that he had heard her. Roxanne picked up on the second ring. "I'm doing it," Daniel said. A pause. "When?" Roxanne said. "I'm working on the details," he said. "Don't make it complicated," Roxanne said. "She doesn't want complicated. She wants real." "I know," he said. "And Daniel," Roxanne said. "Yeah. She's been hoping for this since about 4 months after she moved in," Roxanne said. "She just didn't let herself know it." He absorbed that. 4 months. "The tomato soup," Roxanne said. "She called me after the tomato soup. She said she was in trouble. She thought she was catching feelings for her landlord, and she didn't know what to do about it." A pause. "I told her to give it time." 2 years, Daniel said. "Better than never," Roxanne said, and hung up. He sat with his phone in his hand. 4 months after she moved in. She had been carrying this for almost 2 years before he caught up. She had lived in his house in his daily orbit, helping with his daughter and his kitchen and the small architecture of his life, while carrying something she had decided in advance she couldn't have, because that was what she did. She preemptively disqualified herself before someone else could do it. He was going to fix that. Not with a speech. Not with a production. With something real. He spent the following week in a state of focused, quiet purpose that Lily noticed and found suspicious. "Why are you smiling?" she asked him on Monday morning. "I'm in a good mood," he said. "You're always in an okay mood," she said. "Not a smiling mood." She studied him. "Did something happen?" "I'm planning something," he said. Lily's eyes sharpened with the specific gleam of a child who smells a secret. "What kind of something?" "The kind that's not yours yet," Daniel said. She narrowed her eyes. "Is it about Emily?" "Lily." "Because if it is," she said, already turning back to her cereal, "I just want you to know I fully support it." "I'm going to need your help," he said. She looked up. "I'm in," she said immediately before he had said another word. He told her enough to give her a role without giving her enough to accidentally tell Emily, which was a careful needle to thread with a 7-year-old. But Lily rose to the occasion with a seriousness that made him briefly proud to the point of pain. "I will not say anything," Lily told him with the gravity of a person making a military oath. "I am a vault." "You told Emily about the time I forgot to pay the electric bill," Daniel said. "That was important safety information," Lily said. "This is more important," he said. She considered this. "Then I definitely won't tell," she said. He believed her. He was right to. The plan was not elaborate. He had taken Roxanne's advice, "Don't make it complicated," and he had applied it with the same focused simplicity he applied to everything he did well. He made one phone call. He ordered one thing. He talked to Lily once more clearly and completely, and Lily listened with her chin in her hands and at the end said, "That's good, Dad," with the tone of a 7-year-old who was prepared to give a professional assessment and had determined that the work passed. He called Diane. "She's going to cry," Diane said. "I know," he said. "I mean a lot," Diane said. "I'm counting on it," he said. Diane laughed. "You've come a long way from the man who walked into a room full of strangers and didn't know he was engaged," she said. "Don't remind me," he said. "I will be reminding you of that for the rest of your life," Diane said pleasantly, and ended the call. The Saturday he had chosen arrived. He had told Emily nothing. He had managed this through the careful deployment of ordinary behavior, the particular skill of a man who spent years behind a managed exterior and could produce it now for a useful purpose instead of a defensive one. He had been normal all week. He had been present and warm and entirely unremarkable, which was its own kind of acting, but the kind he felt entirely fine about. Saturday morning. Emily came into the kitchen and found Lily already at the table eating cereal, wearing a dress she almost never voluntarily wore, hair brushed to an improbable smoothness. Emily stopped. She looked at Lily. She looked at Daniel, who was standing at the stove with his back to her. "Why is she dressed like that?" Emily said. "We're going somewhere," Daniel said without turning around. "Where?" "You'll see." A pause. He heard her process this. "Should I?" she started. "You look perfect," he said. He turned around. He looked at her directly the way he had been learning to look at her, without the managed distance, without the practical coding. "Exactly as you are." Emily looked at Lily. Lily concentrated very hard on her cereal. "You two are terrible at secrets," Emily said. "We're great at secrets," Lily said with slightly too much emphasis. They drove 20 minutes out of the city, to a place Daniel had found by accident 2 months earlier, on a Sunday when he and Lily had gone for a drive, because Lily believed drives solved most problems, and had communicated this belief with enough conviction that he had agreed to test the theory. It was a property, a small privately owned orchard, on the edge of a family farm that hosted occasional events, and on that Sunday, 2 months ago, he had sat in his truck outside it, and thought with a certainty that surprised him here. He had no idea yet what here was for. He just knew it. Now he knew. The owner, a woman named Jean, who had communicated the entire arrangement through a series of very brief emails, with the energy of someone who had seen enough of life to appreciate directness, had set out a small table and 2 chairs near the oldest tree on the property, which was enormous and old, and had the specific presence of something that has been standing long enough to have opinions. Lily ran ahead, the moment she saw it, then remembered she was supposed to be calm and important, and turned around and walked back to stand beside Daniel with dignity. Emily hadn't said a word since they got out of the truck. She was looking at the table, at the tree, at the specific intention of all of it. She was pressing her lips together in the way she did when she was managing something large. Daniel walked to the table. He picked up the small box that Jean had placed there as agreed. He turned to face Emily. "I'm not going to give you a speech," he said. "Good," Emily said. Her voice was completely unsteady. "I'm not going to tell you about all the things I was too slow to see," he said. "You already know them." "I do," she said. "I'm just going to say you walked into my house 2 years ago, and you paid rent, and you were a good neighbor, and you were kind to my daughter," he said. "And somewhere in the middle of all of that, without asking permission, and without making an announcement, you became the thing I would miss most if it were gone." He paused. "And I don't want to miss it. I don't want to be the man who understood what he had and chose to keep it at a safe distance anyway." He opened the box. "I want to be the man who said so clearly, out loud, in front of this tree." Emily made a sound that was partially laugh and partially the other thing. "In front of this tree, specifically," she said. "Lily helped choose the location," Daniel said. "I knew it," Emily said, and looked at Lily, who was standing 5 feet away, with her hands clasped and her face incandescent. "Emily Brooks," Daniel said. She looked back at him. "Will you please stop being my roommate," he said, "and start being my family, officially, in front of whatever witnesses we have, which is currently my daughter, and a woman named Jean, who I think is watching from the barn." Emily laughed. A real one. She pressed her hand to her mouth. "Yes," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Yes," she said more firmly, because she was not a woman who made important decisions quietly. He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it for a full 3 seconds, and then she looked at him, And what was in her face was something he had not seen there before. Not the careful hope, not the protected wanting, not the braced anticipation of someone waiting for the other shoe. What was in her face was simply belief. She believed him. That was the thing he had been trying to give her. He understood now since the Monday morning in the foyer, when he told her to stop building the exit. That was the whole project underneath all the days and the dinners and the arguments and the chamomile tea and the 6 Saturdays. He had been trying to give her the one thing Marcus and years of preemptive smallness had taken from her. The right to believe she was chosen. Lily collided with both of them at high velocity, wrapping her arms around whatever she could reach, and the three of them stood in a knot near the oldest tree on that property, while Jean watched from the barn door and pressed her own hand briefly to her heart before going back inside, because Jean had seen enough of life to know when to give people their moment. The drive home was loud. Lily had been suppressing her enthusiasm for approximately 4 days, and it came out in a continuous stream on the way back. Questions about when the wedding would be, whether she could be a flower girl, whether Emily would change her name, whether they could get a dog to celebrate, whether the dog could be named Captain. Why not? That was a good name for a dog. Emily answered everything, all of it, with the particular patience of a woman who was so full of her own private joy that Lily's noise was simply part of it, absorbed and welcome. Daniel drove and said nothing. He was listening. He was in the specific language of men who have spent years managing everything from a careful distance, simply present. In the car, in the noise, in the warmth of it. Not bracing, not managing, not filing it somewhere safe. Just there. That was the whole work, he thought. That was the entire achievement stripped of ceremony. To be there without armor. To let the good thing be good without immediately protecting yourself from the possibility of losing it. He was doing it. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, and it was also by significant margin the easiest. That evening, after Lily was finally exhausted into sleep, the crash following days of secret-keeping, and the catharsis of the afternoon. Daniel and Emily sat on the back porch in the October cold that had become November cold. The sharpness of it. Familiar now, the kind of cold that had come to mean something. Emily was looking at the ring. Not constantly, just returning to it. The way you return to something new that has not yet become ordinary. "I should call my mother," she said. "She already knows," Daniel said. Emily turned to look at him. "What?" "I called your father last Saturday," he said. He told her. A beat. "She's known for a week," Emily said. "She wanted to call you immediately," Daniel said. "Your father talked her out of it." Emily stared at him. "She showed enormous restraint," she said. "Apparently Robert made a compelling argument about letting things happen in their own time," Daniel said. Emily shook her head slowly. She was smiling. "He would," she said. She leaned back in her chair and tipped her face up and breathed the cold air that she had once said was honest, and Daniel watched her do it, not managing the watching, not filing it, just watching the woman who had turned his house into a home. Breathed the cold night air with her eyes closed and a ring on her finger, and something finally settled in her face. "Scared?" he asked. "Terrified," she said, eyes still closed. "Me too," he said. "Good," she said. "Means it's real." He reached across the space between their chairs and found her hand. She turned her palm up and held on, and the cold November air moved around them, and the house behind them held the sleeping child who had blessed this thing before it even knew it was a thing, and the particular quiet of two people who have stopped pretending, who have chosen deliberately and clearly, and without conditions, settled around them like the best kind of weight. The kind you don't want to put down. The kind that means you're carrying something worth carrying. Neither of them spoke for a long time. There was nothing left to say that the silence wasn't already saying, and they had both learned in the way that only comes from being present to another person over a sustained and honest stretch of time that not every moment needed words. Some moments just needed you to stay in them. So they stayed. Margaret Brooks called at 7:43 in the morning. Emily had been awake for 6 minutes. She was still in bed, still in the particular softness of early consciousness, where the brain hasn't yet assembled all its defenses, when her phone lit up on the nightstand, and her mother's name appeared, and she answered before she was fully ready to be a person. "I held it for a week," Margaret said without preamble. "An entire week, Emily. Do you understand what that cost me?" Emily sat up. She looked at the ring on her hand, which she had not yet gotten used to, which still surprised her every morning, which she suspected might surprise her for a very long time. "Dad told me," she said. "He made a very persuasive argument," Margaret said. "I did not agree with it, but I respected it. You're welcome." "Thank you, Mom." "Is it beautiful?" Margaret asked. "The ring." Emily looked at it. Simple. White gold. A single stone that caught the morning light from the window and held it. Daniel had not asked Roxanne or Diane what she preferred. He had chosen it himself, which she suspected was the point, and he had chosen correctly, which she suspected was not an accident. "Yes," Emily said. "It's beautiful." Margaret made a sound on the other end of the line that Emily had heard perhaps 4 times in her life, a sound that lived at the precise intersection of relief and joy, and something older than either of those things, something that only mothers make when the thing they have been quietly afraid of for their child has finally resolved in the direction of good. "I have to tell you something," Margaret said. "Okay," Emily said. "I owe you an apology," Margaret said. Emily went still. "Mom, let me say it," Margaret said with the specific firmness of a woman who had prepared this speech and was going to deliver it properly. "I spent years pressuring you, about marriage, about finding someone, and I told myself it was because I loved you, which it was. But it was also because I couldn't accept that maybe the timeline would look different for you than it did for me. And the pressure I put on you made you feel like you were failing at something you were actually just waiting for." Emily's throat tightened. "I made you feel like being alone meant something was wrong with you," Margaret said. "And nothing was ever wrong with you. I want you to know that I know that." The morning light was coming through the window, and Emily sat in it and held the phone and said nothing for a moment, because nothing was required, and also because she didn't trust her voice entirely. "Mom," she said finally. "Yes, you also drove 4 hours with no notice, and accidentally started the chain of events that led to all of this," Emily said. A pause. "That is also true," Margaret said. "So we're complicated even in the good things," Emily said. "Families are," Margaret said. "That's the only kind there is." Emily laughed, and it was wet around the edges, and she didn't apologize for that. They talked for 40 minutes. About the wedding, not the planning of it, not yet, but the wanting of it. About Robert, who Margaret reported had been insufferably pleased with himself since the phone call with Daniel walking around the house in Phoenix with the contained satisfaction of a man who had asked exactly the right question in a backyard and had been answered correctly. About Lily, who Emily told her mother had run approximately 3 victory laps around the orchard before remembering she was supposed to be dignified. "She's extraordinary," Margaret said. "That child." "She is," Emily agreed. "She told me once that you make the lights come on," Margaret said. "I've been thinking about that for weeks." "I know," Emily said. "She told me too." "Do you believe it?" Margaret asked. "Not about the house, about yourself." A pause. "The real kind, not the managed kind." "I'm starting to," Emily said. "Good," said Margaret Brooks. "That's the whole thing right there." They said goodbye. Emily put down the phone and sat in the morning quiet and allowed herself for a full 3 minutes to simply feel the weight of what her life had become, not cataloging it, not managing it, not holding it at the arm's length that had been her lifelong habit, just feeling it. The ring on her finger, the conversation with her mother, the sounds of the house coming alive around her, the particular creak of the hallway she had memorized without meaning to, the sound of Daniel in the kitchen, the high, clear voice of Lily talking to herself with the narrative intensity she brought to all of her solo activities. This was her life. She had not planned it. It had assembled itself quietly and without announcement from 2 years of ordinary mornings and shared evenings and small coordinations and the specific accumulation of a person choosing day after day to stay present to the people in front of them. She got up. She went to the kitchen. Daniel was at the stove and Lily was at the table, and they were in the middle of an argument about whether pancakes were an acceptable dinner food, and both of them looked up when she walked in, and the argument paused with the natural ease of something that had been paused many times before and would resume the moment she sat down. "Dinner pancakes," Emily said, pulling out her chair. "I'm in favor." Daniel pointed his spatula at her. "You are not helping." "Dad said pancakes were breakfast food," Lily said with the energy of someone presenting evidence at trial. "Emily, tell him that food does not have a time." "Food does not have a time," Emily said. "Emily," Daniel said. "You asked me to be part of this family," Emily said. "This is what that looks like." He stared at her for a moment. She held his gaze absolutely calm, the particular calm of a woman who knew she had just won something and was savoring it. "Fine," Daniel said. "Dinner pancakes." Lily threw both arms in the air. And just like that, in the noise and the morning and the warmest ordinary moment imaginable, Emily Brooks understood something that no one had ever been able to give her before, that she was not a guest in this life. She was not a visitor who had made herself useful enough to stay. She was not someone being tolerated or accommodated or loved in spite of the things she'd been told were too much about her. She was home, fully, finally, without condition. The wedding planning began in December and proceeded with the specific organized chaos of an event being planned by a woman who was a professional at making spaces beautiful, and a man who had strong logistical opinions, and a 7-year-old who believed she was the third co-planner and had to be gently redirected every 4 to 5 business days. Lily's contributions were numerous and confident. She believed the wedding should have a dessert table instead of a cake, because variety was important. She believed the music should include at least one song from a cartoon she liked, but was willing to negotiate on this point. She believed Emily's dress should have pockets, because all good dresses had pockets, and this was non-negotiable. Emily agreed on the pockets, unconditionally and immediately. Daniel watched this negotiation from across the kitchen and said nothing, and his face did the thing it had started doing with increasing frequency. The thing where everything he would never have said in a management report or a logistics meeting, or the careful professional language of a guarded man, was completely visible on his face, plain as daylight. He was happy. Not managed happy. Not keeping it together happy. Simply straightforwardly, without conditions or qualifications happy. Roxanne and Diane came to Colorado in January to help Emily with the venue and the dress, which meant 3 days of the kind of friendship that operates at full volume and full honesty, and made Daniel remember watching them in the kitchen on the first evening that Emily had always been this warm and this funny, and this completely unapologetically herself, and that the version of her he had seen in the first months of her living in his house had been the contained version, the careful version, the version that had learned to present a smaller surface area to the world. She didn't do that anymore. He wasn't sure exactly when it had stopped. He thought it had been gradual, a millimeter at a time over months, as the evidence accumulated that the house was safe and the man in it was not going to use her softness against her. He had worked hard to be that evidence. He intended to keep working. "You're good for her," Roxanne told him on the second evening when Emily and Diane had taken Lily to look at something, and Daniel and Roxanne were briefly alone in the kitchen in the particular quiet that follows the exit of loud people. "She's better for me," Daniel said. Roxanne studied him with the direct appraising look she had been giving him since the day they met, the look that had softened incrementally across the months, but never entirely lost its edge. "You actually believe that?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. "Because she's going to need you to keep believing it. On the days she doesn't believe it herself." She picked up her wine glass. "She has those days. She's had them her whole life. Days when the old story is louder than the new one." "I know," he said. "What do you do on those days?" she asked. Daniel thought about Wednesday evenings with the kitchen light on, about chamomile tea and cold air and the specific patience of staying present when the easier thing was to step back. "I stay," he said. Roxanne looked at him for a long moment. Then she raised her glass slightly, the smallest possible toast, and drank. That was enough. January gave way to February, and February to March, and the date they had chosen, the last Saturday of April, arrived, the way dates do when you have been simultaneously dreading and anticipating them with the quality of something moving too fast and not fast enough at the same time. The week before the wedding, Daniel could not sleep. Not from fear. He understood that clearly, which was itself a kind of progress he could distinguish now between the fear that was warning him and the fear that was simply the cost of caring about something completely. This was the second kind. It arrived on Tuesday night, and Wednesday night, and Thursday night, and each time he lay in the dark and identified it correctly and breathed through it and let it pass. On Thursday night, the house was quieter than usual. Lily was at a sleepover at her school friend Becca's house. A carefully coordinated absence that had involved Claire, who had been matter-of-fact and gracious about the whole thing, in the way she had been matter-of-fact and gracious about most things in the past several months. As if Daniel finding happiness had released something in her, too, some residual obligation to the old story. He was grateful for that in the specific way you are grateful for things that require no acknowledgement. I was in the kitchen at 11:30 when Emily appeared. She did not look like a woman who had been sleeping either. She sat across from him, and they looked at each other in the kitchen light, the overhead one, the one that had stopped feeling like an interrogation room some time ago, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "You doing okay?" he asked. "I'm terrified," she said. "Me too," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I came out. Because I knew you'd say that." He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. "Tell me the thing you're most afraid of," she said. "The real one." He thought about it. Not the managed version. The real one. "That I'll get it wrong," he said. "Not dramatically wrong. Just the small accumulations of wrong. The closed doors, and the shuttered silences, and the times I default to managing instead of connecting." He paused. "I've done it before. I know my habits." "You've been different," Emily said. "I've been working on it," he said. "But working on it doesn't mean finished." "I don't want finished," she said. "I want working on it." She looked at him steadily. "Do you understand that I don't want someone who has it all figured out? I want someone who is in it, actively, with me." "I'm in it," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I said yes under that tree." He looked at her hand in his. "Tell me yours," he said. "The real one." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the April night was just barely past cold, the specific temperature of a season turning. "That I'll wake up one day," she said. "And the way you look at me will have changed." She kept her voice level with visible effort. "That you'll look at me and see not what you see now, but what I was told I was. Too much. Too big. Not the right shape for someone's story." She paused. "Marcus looked at me differently at the end. I saw it happening. I watched it, and I didn't say anything because I already knew, and I was just waiting for him to catch up." She exhaled. "I don't want to watch that happen with you." He held her hand tighter. "Listen to me," he said. She looked at him. "I have looked at you every day for 2 years," he said. "And I need you to understand the looking has not gotten less. It has gotten more. Every argument and every difficult Tuesday and every ordinary evening has added to it, not subtracted." He paused. "The way I look at you is not a condition that expires. It's an understanding I arrived at. And I arrived at it through evidence, not feeling. Feelings change. Evidence accumulates." Emily pressed her lips together. "You are not too much," he said. "You are exactly the right amount. You are the amount that was needed for this house and this child and this life to function the way they were supposed to function." He looked at her directly. "I will tell you that as many times as it takes for the old story to stop being louder than the new one." She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, the thing that had been in her face on the day he proposed the belief, the simple, complete, unguarded belief, was there again. More settled this time. More sure of its own right to exist. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. They sat in the kitchen for another hour talking about nothing important. The wedding logistics that were already handled. A movie Lily wanted to see. a client of Emily's who had finally committed to a color for their living room after 4 months of deliberation. The kind of conversation that is made entirely of the small currency of a shared life and is worth more than any of the large denominations. At 12:40, Emily said she was going to try to sleep. She stood up and she looked at him across the kitchen table and she said, "Thank you," and he knew she didn't mean for the conversation. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to." She went to her room. The room that had been the spare bedroom for 2 years and would be their room in 5 days. And Daniel sat for a few more minutes alone in the kitchen and let himself simply be a man at a table in a house that had become the best version of his life 4 days before the moment it became official. He was not afraid. Not anymore. The Saturday arrived clear and cold and bright, the specific April weather of Colorado that can't decide between winter and spring and splits the difference, and Daniel Carter stood in the living room. The same living room where 11 months ago, 6 strangers had turned to look at him. And he thought about that night. He thought about the pause before the door. He thought about Emily's hand taking his, the terrified grip of it, the fake smile she had turned on her family, while her eyes communicated an entire emergency to him. He thought about how he had stood in the middle of a fiction and slowly over the following 48 hours, discovered that the fiction was built from true material. He fixed his tie, and Lily appeared at his elbow, already dressed the dress with the pockets she had approved personally, and was wearing with the seriousness of someone who understood her ceremonial role. "You look nice, Dad," she said. "You look beautiful," he said. She examined him. "Are you nervous?" "A little," he said. She considered this. "I'm not," she said. "No, because I already know how it ends," she said with the complete confidence of a child who has never doubted this outcome for a single moment. "You get Emily. Emily gets us, and everything works out." He looked at his daughter, her matter-of-fact certainty, her absolute unguarded faith in the simple arithmetic of love, and felt something move through him that he didn't have precise language for. Something that lived below the reach of words. "Yeah," he said, "that's pretty much it." She straightened his tie, which did not need straightening, and walked to the door. The ceremony was at the orchard. Jean had set out chairs, and someone had strung lights between the old trees, and Lily walked ahead of Emily with a small basket of flowers that she distributed with the focused professionalism of a woman who had practiced this specific activity 4 times in the preceding week. Robert Brooks walked his daughter down the aisle between the chairs, and when he placed Emily's hand in Daniel's, he looked at Daniel with the same look he'd given him in the backyard 11 months ago. But different now. The question replaced by its answer, the measuring replaced by something simpler. Gratitude. Daniel held Emily's hand. He looked at her face. She was not performing anything. She was not managing anything. She was standing in the cold April light, in a dress with pockets, and looking at him with the full, open, undefended expression of a woman who had finally stopped bracing for impact and had discovered that the ground was solid. They said what they had written. Simple words, not the borrowed language of ceremonies, but their own worked out over 2 evenings at the kitchen table, with coffee and crossed-out drafts, and Lily occasionally offering editorial opinions before being sent to do homework. Words that said what they meant without dressing it up in ceremony. Daniel said, "You walked into my house, and you never once pushed me toward anything I wasn't ready for, and you paid that price quietly for 2 years, and you never made me feel guilty for it. I am done being worth that patience. I intend to be worth something better," Emily said. "I spent my whole life getting smaller, so the world would be less disappointed in me. You made me understand that the world was wrong, not me. I will spend the rest of my life being the size I actually am, and I will spend it with you." Margaret pressed her tissue to her face. Roxanne in the front row was not even pretending to be composed. Robert Brooks sat with his hands folded and his eyes bright and said nothing, which was the loudest thing in the room. When it was done, and they were walking back between the chairs, Lily fell into step beside them and took one of each of their hands. One hand for Daniel and one hand for Emily, and she walked between them with the complete settled confidence of a child who is exactly where she is supposed to be. That was the image Daniel would carry for the rest of his life. Not the ceremony, not the vows. that the three of them walking between the rows of chairs, Lily holding both their hands, the cold April light on all of them, the old trees standing in their particular ancient silence around the whole thing, like witnesses who had agreed to keep the story. The reception was at the house. Their house. It was loud and warm and full of exactly the right people. Margaret and Robert, Roxanne and Diane, Carol and Phil, Becca's mom, who had become a friend, two of Daniel's colleagues, who had watched the change in him over the past year with the careful attention of people who genuinely liked the man and were glad to see him arriving somewhere. Claire sent flowers, which surprised him, and shouldn't have. At some point in the evening, Daniel found himself standing at the edge of the gathering, the old habit, the one he'd spent a year learning to interrupt, and this time he caught himself doing it. He caught himself stepping back from the warmth and the noise, and he recognized it for exactly what it was. Not preference, not personality, but protection. The managed distance. The old software. He stepped back in. He walked back into the noise and the warmth, and he found Emily in the middle of it, laughing at something Roxanne had said, her head thrown back, completely unguarded, the version of herself she had become, or rather, he thought had always been waiting for the conditions that would let her be it. She saw him coming. She reached out and took his hand, without interrupting the conversation, without making a production of it. Just reached out. Knew he was there, pulled him in, he stayed in. Later, after the guests had gone, and Lily had been carried to bed in the specific dead weight of a child who has overextended herself at a celebration, and the house was quiet, in the way it was quiet after full things emptied to their right size. Daniel and Emily stood in the living room. The same living room. He had thought about this moment, he realized. Not planned for it, not anticipated it consciously, but somewhere in his understanding of this day, he had known they would end up here, in this room, in the place where it started. Emily was looking around it. He watched her do it, taking in the room, the way you take in a familiar place that has acquired new meaning, seeing all the old things, with the additional weight of what they now carried. "This is where you froze," she said. "Yes," he said. "I grabbed your hand," she said. "Right there." "You had a grip like a socket wrench," he said. She laughed. He would never stop wanting to produce that laugh. "I was so terrified," she said. "You didn't show it," he said. "I showed it," she said. "You just didn't know what to look for yet." He thought about that. "You're right," he said. "I know now." She turned to look at him. The same room. Completely different everything. "Do you ever think about it?" she said. "What would have happened if you'd said no? If you'd walked in and immediately told my family the truth?" He thought about it. "Yes," he said. "I think I would have handled it correctly and efficiently and lost everything." She was quiet. "I think I was very lucky," he said, "that I had 48 hours in a pretend relationship before I had to decide what to do with a real one." "It was a good pretend relationship," Emily said. "Phenomenal," he said. "The fake proposal especially." She pressed her hand over her mouth. "The best fake engagement story anyone has ever told at a dinner table," she said. "A Sunday morning," he said. "Coffee, quiet. The right thing already present." She looked at him. "That was real," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why it worked." Done. They stood in the quiet of the room that had held the beginning of everything, and the house held them the way it always held them, steadily, without commentary, with the patient solidity of a place that has seen enough to know when to simply be present for what is happening inside it. Margaret had called it a full house. Claire had called it the right thing. Lily had said Emily made the lights come on. Diane had said she'd been braver than she looked. Roxanne had said present was what mattered. Robert had said the men worth knowing weren't the ones who avoided the pain. All of them had been saying the same thing Daniel understood in the specific language available to each of them. They had all been pointing at the same simple, irreducible fact. That two people had arrived at each other through the accumulation of ordinary days and had chosen with full information and clear eyes and considerable fear to stay. That was the whole story. That was all it had ever been. Daniel Carter, who had once stood at his own front door bracing himself for whatever was on the other side, looked at his wife in the room where they had begun. Not the beginning. He would have designed, not the beginning. anyone would have written, but the truest kind, the kind that happens before you know it's happening. And he felt the familiar pause before the door. He did not brace. He opened it. And everything on the other side was exactly, completely, irreversibly worth it. That was not an accident. That was what two people built day by day, and choice by choice, and cup of coffee by cup of coffee. When they finally decided to stop pretending the thing between them wasn't the most important thing in the room, they built it from ordinary materials. And it held.